How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Dragon's Den. Today we're going to be doing another deck tech. I'm going to let you know straight up on the upfront, this isn't a budget build per se, but it's also not a crazy sort of like super expensive CDH build. This is meant to be a powerful casual deck. So if we're using the old system, it'd be, I'd say, probably around an 8. If we're using the new system, I don't think it's strong enough to be considered a 4. But then again, like, the new system's a little confusing, so I'd say it's probably a high 3. So let's go on and get to it and get through all the cards. This is going to be everything except the lands. The land base is completely subjective, however you want to build the land base. So this is going to be covering all the non-land cards. And the breakdown of the deck is 66 cards, 34 lands, and that 66 includes the commander. So let's get on into it. The commander is Alela, Artful Provocateur, which is 1 black, 1 blue, 1 white, and 1 generic for a 2/3 fairy warlock. It has flying, death touch, and lifelink. Other creatures you control with flying get +1/+0. Whenever you cast an artifact or an enchantment spell, you create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. So this thing does a lot by being a lord that pumps all your flyers, having 3 different keywords, and creating 1/1 flyers every time you cast an artifact and enchantment. This could be built as fairy tribal, but that's not what I've done with it. I actually have this commander deck built. It does really, really well in my play group. I think it's won every game it's ever been in with the exception of 1. So it's a really, really strong deck that does a lot of things really good. But I really focused on the token aspect of it and creating as many fairies as I can. And so it plays a lot into the artifact and enchantment side of what this commander does. So let's get through our mana rocks really quick. We're going to cover these really fast. No sense in going over all of them. We've got Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Azorius Signet, Dimir Signet, Orzhov Signet, Talisman of Hierarchy, Talisman of Progress, Talisman of Dominance, Thought Vessel, and Chromatic Lantern. So most of these are 2 mana rocks. Ramping on 2 is the new standard, or it's been the standard for a while now in Commander, so you want to be ramping on turn 2. So the vast majority of the ramp in this is 2 mana rocks. However, I've decided to add Chromatic Lantern, which used to be a staple of the format, but has really fallen out of favor. The reason I like Chromatic Lantern in this deck is, outside of it being a mana rock, you are going to get some additional benefit off of making a 1/1 if you cast it later. And it color fixes your lands, which is never a bad thing in 3 or more colors. Being completely color fixed, it definitely helps with that. So that was our mana ramp right there. That's all the mana rocks in the deck. As we start going through these cards, just go ahead and assume that anything that is an artifact or enchantment outside of what the artifact or enchantment actually does on face value, that it gives us a net benefit by creating a 1/1 flyer when we cast it. So every single artifact and enchantment in this deck automatically synergizes with our commander by making a fairy. So we're just going to say that on the upfront so that we can actually just sort of focus on what some of these cards do. Oh, I forgot. So first we got Cloud Key. Cloud Key, while there is a pretty even split of artifacts and enchantments in the deck, Cloud Key can reduce one or the other. And whenever you play Cloud Key, you can just pick whichever one you happen to have more of in your hand at the moment, or whichever one you think you're going to be playing more of to get a little bit of cost reduction, and it makes a fairy. And then Helm of Awakening, which is a 2 mana artifact that's going to make everybody's spells cost 1 generic less, which you'll be getting more value off of every spell you cast compared to other people, because you're getting the benefit of the spell you cast plus making the 1/1 on just about everything that you do. So while you're lowering your opponent's spells by 1 as well, you're going to get more benefit off of it. So Those are in there for some cost reduction to also help get you ahead in the game. First, we want to do some pillow fort stuff. So you want to be able to protect yourself while you build out your army of fairies to do whatever it is you feel like doing with them. This deck does a lot of things, and it does all the things really well, and they all sort of synergize and bounce off of each other, even though it's a bunch of different aspects and a bunch of different things that do different things. So we want some pillow fort cards. So we have Norn's Annex. If your opponents can't make white, it's costing them life for each creature to be able to attack you. This is really good against things like goblins, elves, sapling, any sort of like big go-wide strategy. If they don't make white, they have to pay life to attack you, and this can completely protect you on its own against that. Ghostly Prison, also making people have to pay 2 to attack you per creature. Propaganda, people have to pay 2 per creature to attack you. You're really starting to pillow fort. And then Sphere of Safety, where they have to pay X per creature to attack you, where X is the number of enchantments you control, and you're going to be controlling a lot of enchantments. So once you get some of these pillow fort pieces out, you can pretty much swing out every single turn without having to worry about much retaliation, because it's going to cost so much for your opponents to swing back at you. Next, we want to get to some like anthems, and Gravitational Shift here, which is 2 blue and 3 generic for an enchantment, is sort of a pillow fort piece and a anthem at the same time. So creatures with flying get +2/+0. Well, all your creatures have flying. So all of your creatures automatically have +2/+0, and with your commander out, all of your fairy tokens are getting +3/+0. Just off the rip. So you're making 4 ones every time you cast an enchantment if you have this out. Then, creatures without flying get -2/-0. This again almost works as a pillow fort effect. If your opponents have flying creatures, their flyers also get the benefit of the +2/+0. But your deck is completely built around flying creatures. So you're going to have blockers for that if need be, but if your opponents don't have flyers, which at least in my play group is something that happens a lot, again, it's something that will allow you to swing out every single turn and leave yourself open without having to worry about a bunch of damage coming back at you. So other anthems, we have Intangible Virtue, giving all of your fairy tokens +1/+1 in Vigilance. Favorable Winds, giving all of your creatures with flying +1/+1. And Caretaker's Talent. Caretaker's Talent takes a little bit more work. So it's 1 white and 2 generic. Whenever 1 or more tokens you control enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So it is a form of card draw in that sense, because you're going to be making fairy tokens on every single one of your turns. So it'll draw you a card. When it becomes level 2, you can create a token, a copy that's a token of a... Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm stuttering right there. You can create a copy of a token that you control. So you can make another fairy by leveling it up for 1. But then once you get it to its final level, level 3, all of your creature tokens get +2/+2. So making your fairies a whole lot bigger. Next, we're going to move on to Patchwork Banner. I didn't include this in the Mana Rock section because the biggest reason it's in here is for the Anthem effect. So for 3 mana, it enters and you choose a creature type. You would choose Fairy. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So now all of your fairy tokens, your commander, and a couple of the other creatures in the deck are all going to get +1/+1. But then it's also a Mana Rock ramping you a little bit. But the primary focus is that +1/+1. This is a really, really good card in this deck. Now we want to get value out of having a lot of artifacts and enchantments outside of what they do. So first we have All That Glitters, which is 1 white, 1 generic, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and enchantment you control. That's basically giving it +1/+1 for all the permanents you're going to be playing in this deck. So I have this deck built, and I can tell you very often, like, it wins through combat damage with the fairy tokens that you're playing. But even though it's not strictly a Voltron deck, it wins through commander damage a lot because of All That Glitters, along with Cranial Plating, giving you're always going to want to put these on your commander. In most cases, like with All That Glitters, that's always going to go on your commander. The equipment aren't necessarily as crucial to put on your commander. Like if you don't have your commander or something else, you can throw it on something else if you want to. Most of the time, I just stack all this on my commander and get big damage out because you'll gain a bunch of life and kill people that way. So cranial plating, giving your giving enchanted or equipped creature +1/+0 for each artifact you control. Nettle Cyst, which is a 3 mana equipment with living weapon, equipped 2. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. So again, doing the same thing that All That Glitters does, pumping your creature by a ton for basically every permanent that you've got. And then Sword of Feast and Famine is another really good equipment. We're kind of getting through the equipment parts of the deck here. So Sword of Feast and Famine, giving your creature +2/+2, and then untapping your lands and making somebody discard a card helps you kind of further yourself with card advantage by messing with your opponent's hands and essentially giving you an extra turn by untapping all your lands in your second main phase, allowing you to use that main phase just like it was any other turn. All right, next we have Helm of the Host. Creating a token copy of your commander every single turn in this deck is absolutely ridiculous, because now for every copy of your commander that you have, all of your fairies, all of your flyers are getting +1/+0 for each copy. And now for every, subsequent artifact or enchantment you cast, you just keep making more and more and more fairy tokens. So it helps your strategy in every way possible. And then we have Skull Clamp. So we have some anthems in the deck. So obviously Skull Clamp loses a little bit of its power when you have some of those anthems out. But there's only so many anthems in the deck. So if you have them out and you have Skull Clamp out, like I said, it loses some of its power. You can still throw it on something to increase its power a little bit and then draw some cards if somebody chooses to block it, or if you leave it up to block something or things like that. But if you don't have any of your anthems out, which does happen from time to time, which is nowhere near the end of the world in this deck, I promise you. If you happen to not have any of your anthems out, Skull Clamp is extremely efficient draw. 1 generic to draw 2 cards. It's really, really, really efficient. So it is good enough to go in the deck, even though sometimes it loses a little bit of its edge, because this deck doesn't have a hard time drawing cards. Then we got Swiftfoot Boots. The whole concept of this deck revolves around you having your commander out and making as many fairy tokens as possible. So being able to protect your commander is extremely important. So Swiftfoot Boots, giving it that hexproof, turning off single target removal against it, is extremely good. Then Lightning Greaves does the same thing. It does Shroud. It might take a little bit more to play around if you want to, play your All That Glitters or something like that. But you're always, or pretty much always, going to have another creature because of your fairy tokens to move this off long enough to do something to your creature and then move it back on. And it does make your commander vulnerable for a moment if you do that. But then again, if you're playing some of your equipment outside of All That Glitters or something like that, you don't have to necessarily put it on your commander for it to be really good. So I think having the protection that Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots give is definitely 100% worth it. Next, we need some card draw. So we have Bident of Thassa for 2 blue and 2 generic. You get it's an enchantment artifact. So either way, it triggers your commander. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Creatures your opponents control attack this turn at Fable. So you can force your opponents to attack on a specific turn if you want them to by paying and tapping the Bident. Or the biggest thing is the card draw. So with you making flyers, and in most games, and especially since you make a bunch of flyers, your opponents aren't going to be able to keep you from hitting them for damage. So Bident of Thassa is an absolutely crazy way to draw a ton of cards while you're throwing damage around. So it really gets you a lot of value, especially for 4 mana. Reconnaissance mission it's similar. It's the same thing. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. It does that line of text is exactly the same. This doesn't allow you to force your opponents to attack, but you're getting the main benefit, which is the card draw, which is what we want off of this. And then worst case scenario, you can cycle it for 2. Robe of the Archmagi, or Archmagi, however you want to say that. This is another really good piece of equipment in this deck that can cause you to draw a ton of cards, especially when comboed with some of the equipment that I went over earlier in the video. So for 1 blue and 2 generic, whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw that many cards. Equip 4, but your commander is a warlock. So if you want to equip this to your commander, which is what you want to do most of the time, it's only equip 1. So equip 1, get it on your commander along with something like All That Glitters, and all of a sudden you can be hitting somebody for 10, 12 damage and drawing that many cards. It's something that I've done several times before, and at worst, if this is the only thing you've got and you throw it on your commander, you're hitting somebody for 2 and you're drawing 2 cards, which in no way is bad. Rhystic Study, everybody knows what Rhystic Study does. Do you pay the 1? Really good card draw. Now we have Rankle, Master of Pranks. Rankle is in here for several reasons. Number 1, it's a fairy, and it's a flyer, so it's going to get the +1/+0 benefit from your commander. So it costs 2 black and 2 generic, and has flying and haste. Whenever Rankle, Master of Pranks deals combat damage to a player, choose any number. Each player discards a card, so that could be you and your opponents if you're just swallowing them in card advantage. Each player loses 1 life and draws a card. So you can draw and discard. You can basically loot with this guy, but then everybody does it. And each player sacrifices a creature. So the draw a card and lose a life and the sacrifice a creature are the 2 biggest reasons this is in here. It's another piece of card draw, allowing you to get an extra card every single turn, even though that also benefits your opponents. Like I said, this is meant to be a high-power casual deck, but it's still a casual deck. So helping your opponents a little bit is not the end of the world. The sacrifice as a creature is a big thing, though, because you're going to be making so many tokens. It's going to hurt you far less to sacrifice a creature. You sacrifice one of your tokens than it is your opponents in most cases, because in most cases your opponents aren't going to have the creatures to be able to sacrifice like that. Next is Zur the Enchanter. Zur the Enchanter is good in here because it's a flyer. It also gets the benefit off of the commander. But whenever it attacks you, search your library for an enchantment card with converted mana cost 3 or less and put it into play. So, the reason this is good is it tutors up any of your 3 or less enchantments and puts them directly into play. So it can get your pillow fort pieces. It can get some of your removal that we'll get to in a little bit. It can get your some of your anthems and things like that. There's so many different things it can grab that in a lot of cases it can just go and get whatever answer you need for the current situation that you're in. Next is Dire Undercurrents, which is 2 hybrid, blue-black, and 3 generic. Whenever a blue creature comes into play under your control, you may have target player draw a card. You would target yourself. Or whenever a black creature comes into play under your control, you may have target player discard a card. So the black creature entering under your control is going to happen a lot less often, but it's mainly in here for the card draw. Because cards like this basically make it where it's play artifact or enchantment, draw a card. Play artifact or enchantment, draw a card. Same reason that Kindred Discovery is in here. It's a 5-drop enchantment. You choose fairy. Now every time you cast something, you make a fairy. When the fairy enters, you draw a card. Next, we want to double our fairy token. So we have some ways to double our token production in here, like Mondrag, which is a 4-mana 4/4. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many of those tokens are created instead. This is one of the few creatures in the deck, and it's because of what it does, the token doubling effect. This is also where the budget on this deck starts to get up a little bit, because token doubling effects are rather expensive, but these are the cards that are most easily replaceable in here if you are trying to build this on a smaller budget. So, because the deck is still going to function just fine and still be really strong if token doubling effects are outside of your budget. And then if you want to pay the 3 down here, you can sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures and put an indestructible counter on this, which may not be bad because basically if somebody like you're staring down a board wipe, you can pay 4 life and 1 generic and sacrifice 2 creatures that are going to leave anyway in the face of that board wipe to keep your token doubler. Next is O'Hare Talk, Deepest Foundation, 6 mana, 6/6 with Vigilance, and it actually triples the amount of tokens that you would create. So that's extremely good, especially whenever you're making 3 tokens now for every single spell that you cast. And then when it dies, you return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. I did not have the foresight to get the back side of this card, but I do know that in this cycle, there's a way that on the back side you can flip it back over to the front side. So this is another thing that's really hard to get rid of. And next is Anointed Procession. Just a 4 mana, double your tokens. It's an enchantment, not a creature. So the benefit off your commander of already making a fairy just to cast it. Smothering Tithe. Everybody knows what Smothering Tithe does. It's going to make you a ton of treasures over the course of the game, ramping you, pumping your commander if you have the right equipment and stuff. Just really good. True Conviction, 6 mana, creatures you control have double strike and lifelink. So at worst, with none of your other stuff out, just your commander, you're going to have 2 ones with double strike, lifelink, and flying, which is insanely good. And these are just good cards to have in here in general, like a Chroma's Memorial, 7-drop artifact. Creatures you control have flying, first strike, vigilance, trample, haste, and protection from black and red. Turns off 2 really good removal colors and adds a bunch of keywords to your stuff. Really, really worth running. Aetherflux Reservoir. See, I haven't got to the lifelink sub-theme of this deck, but this deck gains life extremely well. You cast a lot of spells in the same turn. You gain a lot of life off your commander. There's a lot of cards in here we're going to get to in a little bit that will gain you a ton of life. Aetherflux Reservoir can really help you finish out a game. A Johnny's Welcome. 1 mana enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Super simple, super easy. Soul's Attendant. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you may gain 1 life. You're making a bunch of tokens. You like to gain life when they enter. If you're playing against other people with go-wide strategies, this definitely helps you survive that. Daxos, Blessed by the Sun. Enchantment creature. Whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield or dies, you gain 1 life. It'll gain you a ton of life and trigger your commander. And Soul Warden does the same thing as Soul's Attendant. Any creature enters anywhere, you gain a life. We like gaining life around here, so it's very good. Cleric class. If you would gain life, you gain that much life plus 1 instead, so it's going to, with your things like Daxos, Soul's Attendant, Soul Warden, things like that, it'll double up your life gain. You can level it up to start putting 1/1 counters on stuff when you gain life, which is going to happen a lot. And then, when it becomes level 3, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You gain life equal to its toughness. So you return any creature back, you gain life equal to its toughness. There's not a lot of creatures in the deck, but the ones that you have in the deck, you really like having. And then we have Heliod Sun Crown, which is 3 mana, 5/5 with Indestructible. You can pay 2 to give another creature lifelink. Whenever you gain life, you put a 1/1 counter on stuff, and if your devotion to white is 5 or less, it's not a creature. Sanguine Bond. If we're going to be gaining all this life, we want our opponents to lose life. So it's a 5 mana enchantment. When you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Super simple. Can make your opponents, knock your opponents out of the game super, super quick. But if we're running enchantments and we're running Sanguine Bond, of course we're running Exquisite Blood. 5 mana enchantment. When an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. You just drain your opponents out of the game like it's nothing. It is an infinite combo. It's the only infinite combo in the deck, but that's because both of these pieces serve a purpose on their own, even if you don't have the other. If somebody stops your combo, either one of these pieces on their own are extremely good in this deck. We need some removal. Grasp of Fate. A 3 mana enchantment that when it enters, you exile 1 target non-land permanent for each opponent that you have until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. Banishing Light is a 3 mana enchantment that when it enters, you exile target non-land permanent until it leaves the battlefield. We have Swords to Plowshares, one of the most iconic removal spells ever in Commander. You exile something, your opponent gains life. Path to Exile, same deal. 1 mana, instant speed, you exile something, they go get a basic land. Then we have Liliana Dreadhorde General. She serves two different purposes in this deck. When a creature you control dies, draw a card. That's pretty good. So you can plus it to make a 2/2 black zombie, which is, it's okay. It's not the greatest thing in the world. It's not necessarily why this is in here. The -4, on the other hand, each player sacrifices 2 creatures. Just like with Rankle, it's a lot easier for you to sacrifice creatures than it is for your opponent. So this can be used as a piece of removal. So you drop it, you -4, you get rid of a bunch of creatures your opponents control. You sacrifice 2 of your fairies, and you draw 2 cards. So being able to hit your opponents for that, like make them sacrifice their creatures, and then you also get to draw cards off of it at a minimal price, is exactly why this is in here. And then obviously if you ult it, the ult can absolutely be game ending. Next we need some removal. So we have Darksteel Mutation. We continue with our removal, excuse me. It's a 2-mana artifact, or a 2-mana enchantment aura. You turn any of your opponent's creatures into a 0/1 indestructible bug with no abilities. Witness Protection for 1 mana. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green and white citizen creature token with base power and toughness 1/1 named Legitimate Business Person. And Amphibian Downpour. This has Flash and Storm, so if there's a turn where people are casting a bunch of spells, or even on your turn where you're casting a bunch of spells, this can remove several threats off the board for the price of 1 card. 1 blue, 2 generic, with Flash and Storm, enchant creature. Enchant creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power and toughness 1/1. So you hit several different things on the same turn. And you turn any creature into a 1/1 with no abilities. The only thing worse than somebody outright killing your commander is turning it into something else. It's honestly the worst. Next we have Flowering of the White Tree, which is a legendary enchantment for 2 white. Legendary creatures you control get +2/+1 and have ward 1. So it pumps your commander and gives it ward 1, which is just a little bit of protection. Non-legendary creatures you control get +1/+1, so it pumps all of your fairy tokens. Alright, next up, we have the Meat Hook Massacre for 2 black and X. It's a legendary enchantment. When the Meat Hook Massacre enters the battlefield, each creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. It's a board wipe. That's how you use this, is a board wipe. When a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. You're going to have a bunch of fairies. All of your opponents are going to lose a bunch of life because of that. So if you're at the right place in the game, this can outright end the game. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you gain 1 life. So it sort of plays into your life gain strategy as well. And it's an enchantment. It works really good. Which is also why Meat Hook Massacre 2, the sequel, is also really, really good in this deck for 4 black and double X. Each player sacrifices X creatures, so you sacrifice tokens. Whenever a creature you control dies, you may pay 3 life. If you do, return that card under your control with a finality counter on it. This helps you keep your commander. It's protection, paying 3 life the first time your commander dies to bring it back without having to pay commander tax and add on to your commander tax and everything else. 3 life is a very small price to pay to be able to do that. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, they may pay 3 life. If they don't, return that card under your control with a finality counter on it. So now, all the creatures your opponents sacrifice, they either pay 3 life for each of those to keep them in their graveyard, or if they don't pay, you gain control of those. So taking something away from your opponent and giving it to yourself is extremely strong, or hitting your opponents for 3 for everything they lose going forward is also extremely strong. Well, the biggest weakness of this deck, or one of the biggest weaknesses, is obviously mass enchantment and artifact removal. So, Wave of Vitriol, Season of Gathering, things like that. So we need ways to be able to keep our stuff in play or make sure that we can get it back. So we have Open the Vaults for 6 mana. Return all artifacts and enchantment cards from all graveyards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So this also gets your opponent's stuff back, but I promise you, you are going to have way more artifacts and way more enchantments than your opponents. So you are going to get way more value out of this than they ever do. And then the last card in the deck is Elixir of Immortality. For 1 generic mana, you get an artifact. And you can pay 2 and tap it. You gain 5 life. you shuffle Elixir of Immortality and your graveyard into their owner's library. So, for 2 mana, it's a 3 total mana investment, but it's a 1-drop artifact. You're going to make a fairy, and your graveyard is protected. So if somebody destroys all your stuff, you simply pay 2, gain some life, shuffle it all back in, and you essentially start your game over again with all of your stuff being back in your library so that you can potentially draw into it and play it out again. So those are the only 2 cards to protect against mass artifact and enchantment removal. But the only time you're going to be playing against mass artifact and enchantment removal is if you're playing against green, which is green is a very popular color. So it's possible, but then even then they have to be running those cards. So I don't think you need a lot of protection for your artifacts and enchantments. That's why there's only 2 cards in here to do it. Whereas a lot of this stuff is meant to protect your commander more than anything. Because your commander is the key to the success of this deck. So protect your commander at all costs. So there is more ways in here to protect your commander compared to other things. But that's the entire deck list. It's, like I said, it's meant to be a high power casual deck. I'd say it's probably an 8 on the old scale, a high 3 on the new scale. So with that being said, let me know what you think about this deck list. If you have an Alela deck, tell me if you found anything in here you didn't think of running before. Tell me what you think about how it synergizes. I want to know your guys' opinions. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you next time.